The realization that clarity can actually increase with age often strikes as a radical impossibility in a culture obsessed with youth. Most individuals accept a slow, foggy decline as the inevitable tax of living past 50, viewing every misplaced key or forgotten name as a symptom of unchangeable decay. This fatalistic surrender creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where the mind is allowed to atrophy not because of biology, but because the rigorous training of awareness has ceased. There is, however, a profound alternative rooted in the ancient discipline of self-mastery, which views the aging mind not as a crumbling vessel, but as a garden requiring sharper tools and deeper cultivation. By observing the subtle interplay between physical posture, breath, and mental retention, one can detect the early tremors of cognitive slip before they become earthquakes. This exploration offers a specific framework to recognize these hidden signals, not to induce fear, but to ignite the precise discipline needed to reclaim a vitality that is both mental and spiritual. The erosion of conscious intent, the first subtle indication that memory is slipping, often manifests not as a failure of storage, but as a failure of initial registration known as the erosion of conscious intent. Biologically, the brain requires a specific threshold of attention to encode a short-term sensory experience into a long-term memory, a process heavily reliant on the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. When an individual operates on autopilot, moving through daily rituals without the sharpness of presence, the neural encoding process is shallow and fragile. Shi Heng Yi emphasizes that the mind is often clouded by a lack of clear purpose in the present moment, leading to a state where the individual is physically present but mentally absent. This absence is not a disease, but a habit of disengagement where the vital energy, or qi, is not directed toward the immediate action. The brain efficiently discards information it deems irrelevant, and if the conscious intent was never fully formed, the memory trace simply never exists. A common applied scenario involves the experience of walking into a room and immediately forgetting the purpose of the journey. In this moment, the person stands in the doorway, scanning the environment for a clue that is not there because the original thought was never anchored with sufficient weight. The individual was likely thinking about the next task, a past conversation, or a low-level anxiety, while moving physically toward the kitchen or office. The body performed the mechanical action of walking, but the mind had already drifted to a different temporal coordinate. This is often dismissed as a senior moment, yet it is more accurately a mindlessness moment where the synchronization between thought and action has fractured. The panic that ensues often exacerbates the fog, creating a feedback loop of stress that further inhibits memory retrieval. Shi Heng Yi teaches that this phenomenon is linked to the hindrance of sloth and torpor, a heaviness of mind that prevents clarity. It is not necessarily physical tiredness, but a lack of mental sharpness and a dullness of the spirit. When the mind lacks the cutting edge of determination, it slides over details rather than grasping them. The remedy lies in the reconstruction of or intention, where every small action is performed with total commitment. This requires a deliberate slowing down to ensure that the mind arrives in the room at the exact same moment as the body. The practice of uniting the mind and body in simple tasks, like drinking tea or opening a door, acts as a gymnasium for the attention span, strengthening the neural pathways that support memory. It is important to distinguish this lack of intent from genuine cognitive impairment or neurological degeneration. There are moments when fatigue, grief, or acute stress naturally deplete the brain's resources, rendering high-level focus impossible for anyone, regardless of age. A person navigating a significant life trauma may experience memory lapses that are protective mechanisms or side effects of cortisol flooding rather than signs of permanent decline. Furthermore, in high-stimulus environments where information overload is constant, the brain's filtering mechanism may simply be overwhelmed. In these cases, the forgetfulness is a sign of a healthy brain prioritizing survival over the storage of trivial data. It is perfectly normal to occasionally misplace an item when the house is chaotic or the mind is burdened with heavy news. However, when the lack of intent becomes the default state of existence, the danger increases. The individual begins to live in a perpetual gray zone where days blend together because no specific moment was vivid enough to be retained. This creates a subjective sense of time accelerating, as there are no mental landmarks to slow the passage of weeks and months. The discipline required here is the refusal to multitask and the commitment to monotasking with intensity. By anchoring the mind in the sensation of the here and now, the encoding machinery of the brain is engaged fully. The memory is not lost. It is simply waiting for the person to show up and claim it. Deepening this practice reveals that the clarity of memory is intrinsically linked to the clarity of the will. If one does not care deeply about the present, the brain will not save it. The cultivation of curiosity and the active decision to deem the present moment worthy of remembering changes neurochemistry. Shi Heng Yi points out that self-mastery is not about suppressing the mind, but about directing it with laser-like precision. When the intention is strong, the memory is robust. The slip in memory is often a slip in the standard one holds for their own level of engagement with life. How often am I physically moving while my mind is completely elsewhere? The silent withdrawal of physical presence, a profound and often overlooked warning sign of cognitive drift, is found in the deterioration of physical coordination and the subtle disconnection from the body's sensory feedback. The brain and the body are not separate entities, but a continuous loop of communication. The cerebellum, which governs balance and fine motor skills, has dense connections to the areas of the brain responsible for cognitive processing and emotional regulation. Shi Heng Yi often speaks to the necessity of physical cultivation as the foundation for mental high performance, noting that a stagnant body houses a stagnant mind. When an individual begins to lose the crispness of their physical movements, stumbling slightly more often, dropping objects, or finding their handwriting deteriorating, it is a signal that the neural network's integration is weakening. This physical clumsiness is a loud broadcast that the brain's processing speed and its ability to map the body in space are being compromised. The mechanism here involves proprioception, the body's ability to sense its position in space, and the vestibular system. As people age, they often unconsciously restrict their range of motion, moving less and engaging in fewer complex physical tasks. This reduction in physical demand tells the brain that high-speed processing and precise motor control are no longer necessary survival skills. Consequently, the synaptic connections supporting these functions begin to prune away. A person might notice they have trouble navigating a crowded sidewalk without stopping to think, or that they cannot walk and talk simultaneously without one of the two functions suffering. This dual task interference is a critical marker. If walking requires so much cognitive load that the person forgets the conversation, the automaticity of the body has faltered, draining resources from the memory centers. Consider the applied scenario of a person attempting to learn a new physical skill, such as a dance step or a martial arts form, and finding themselves completely unable to translate the visual instruction into motor action. They see the movement, they understand it intellectually, but the signal to the limbs is garbled and slow. In daily life, this might look like an increasing difficulty in manipulating small objects such as buttons or clasps, accompanied by a rising frustration. The individual might withdraw from activities that require physical dexterity, preferring the safety of the chair. This withdrawal accelerates the decline, as the brain is deprived of the rich sensory input that comes from movement. The body becomes a cage rather than an instrument, and the mind retreats inward, losing its anchor in the physical reality. It is crucial to resolve the misunderstanding that memory is solely a cerebral activity performed in the quiet of a library. The midpoint of this understanding is that the body is the battery for the brain. Shi Heng Yi emphasizes that without the circulation of energy through physical discipline, the mind lacks the fuel to retain information. The breath is the bridge, shallow Anxious breathing deprives the brain of oxygen and signals a state of emergency that prioritizes immediate survival over long-term memory storage. By re-engaging the body through grounded stances, conscious breathing, and complex movement, the individual forces the brain to neurochemically upgrade. The challenge of balancing on one leg or holding a low stance stimulates the release of neurotrophic factors that directly support the health of the hippocampus. There are, of course, orthopedic or systemic reasons for physical clumsiness that are unrelated to cognitive decline. Arthritis, vision changes, or inner ear infections can cause balance issues that mimic the neurological disconnect, but stem from mechanical or sensory organ failure. A person with a stiff knee walking cautiously is not necessarily experiencing brain fog. They are managing pain. It is the combination of cognitive slowing and physical unsteadiness that warrants attention. If the physical clumsiness is paired with a sense of confusion or a difficulty in mapping out a route to a familiar location, the link is stronger. The limitation of this sign lies in the specific medical history of the individual, which must always be factored into the assessment. Nevertheless, the restoration of physical presence is a direct path to the restoration of mental acuity. The practice involves bringing the awareness back into the fingertips and the soles of the feet. When the body is alert, the mind is alert. The lethargy that dulls the memory is often a reflection of the lethargy in the limbs. By demanding precision from the body, placing a cup down without a sound, walking with a silent tread, sitting with an erect spine, the individual trains the mind to be vigilant. This vigilance translates into a stickier memory, as the brain is kept in a state of readiness. The wisdom of the Shaolin arts suggests that the external form drives the internal essence. If the posture collapses, the spirit and the mind collapse with it. Recovering the vertical alignment of the spine and opening the chest allows for deeper respiration, which immediately clears the fog of fatigue. The warning sign is not just the stumble, it is the acceptance of the stumble. The counter move is to treat every physical action as a martial art, executing it with deliberate grace and total attention. Do I inhabit my body with precision, or am I dragging it along? The stagnation of fluid adaptability, a third and pervasive warning sign, is the calcification of emotional responses and a growing resistance to novelty, often masquerading as a preference for tradition or routine. While the brain thrives on patterns, a rigid refusal to adapt to new methods, technologies, or social dynamics indicates a loss of neuroplasticity. Shi Heng Yi speaks of the hindrance of skeptical doubt and the rigidity of views, where the mind becomes so attached to how things were that it loses the ability to process how things are. This is not merely a personality quirk. It represents a cognitive shrinking. When the brain stops encountering and solving new problems, the synaptic density required for sharp memory and quick recall begins to thin. The individual becomes easily agitated when a routine is disrupted because their cognitive reserve is too low to handle the unexpected variable. Biologically, this state is linked to the stress response system. A brain that is losing its flexibility perceives novelty as a threat, triggering the release of cortisol, which, over time, is toxic to memory centers. The individual may find themselves reacting with disproportionate anger or anxiety to minor changes, such as a new layout in the grocery store or a software update on their phone. This emotional reactivity is a defense mechanism covering for the fact that the brain is struggling to learn and map the new environment. The memory slip here is a failure to update the internal model of the world. The person relies on old maps for a new territory, and when they get lost, they blame the territory rather than their outdated map. An applied scenario can be seen in social interactions where the individual dominates the conversation with repetitive stories from the distant past, unable to track or retain the details of the immediate dialogue. They might ask the same question multiple times in a short span, not because they didn't hear the answer, but because the answer didn't fit into their rigid internal script, and thus it slid off the surface of their mind. This often leads to social withdrawal, as the effort required to keep up with the fluid, fast-paced nature of group conversation becomes exhausting. The person retreats into the safety of solitude or the company of those who reinforce their static worldview, further depriving the brain of the social stimulation that is crucial for cognitive health. A reflective point arises when one observes the nature of their own resistance. Often, the anger felt toward a new challenge is actually fear of one's own diminishing capacity to master it. Shi Heng Yi notes that the master is always a beginner, maintaining an empty cup to receive new tea. The warning sign is the full cup, the mind that says I know enough or I am too old to learn this. This attitude is a voluntary shutdown of the learning machinery. The antidote is the deliberate cultivation of beginner's mind, forcing oneself to engage with unfamiliar tasks, whether it is learning a new language, a musical instrument, or simply a different route to the market. This friction is the whetstone that sharpens the memory. It is important to acknowledge that a preference for stability is a natural part of maturing. Not every refusal to adopt a new trend is a sign of cognitive decline. It may be a sign of discernment and wisdom. A person may choose to avoid social media not because they cannot learn it, but because they value their peace. The distinction lies in the capability versus the choice. The warning sign is present when the individual cannot adapt even when they need or want to, or when the reaction to the requirement of adaptation is panic rather than preference. Ultimately, the fluidity of the mind is the guardian of memory. A mind that flows like water, navigating obstacles without getting stuck, retains its clarity. The rigidity of the ego, which insists on being right and remaining comfortable, is the enemy of longevity. By actively seeking out the uncomfortable and the unknown, the individual signals to the brain that growth is still required. The memory improves because the brain understands that it is still in the business of survival and expansion. The stagnation of the will to learn is the precursor to the stagnation of the memory itself. When did I last embrace a change that made me feel incompetent? Cultivating the everlasting mind, the journey through these warning signs, the loss of intent, the physical disconnect, and the emotional rigidity, leads to a singular, empowering conclusion. The aging mind is not destined for darkness, but it demands a higher standard of stewardship. The synthesized insight from Shi Heng Yi's philosophy is that memory is not a passive archive, but an active, living muscle of the consciousness. The symptoms of slipping memory are often symptoms of a life lived with decreasing awareness. The fragmented attention, the slumped posture, and the stubborn refusal to grow are the cracks through which memory leaks. To seal these cracks requires a holistic return to the self, a reintegration of the scattered parts of the psyche into a cohesive, disciplined whole. The promise of this approach is that by addressing the root causes, the lack of intent, the weakness of the physical vessel, and the hindrances of the mind, one does not just patch a leaking memory. One constructs a fortress of vitality. The practice of Ma Bu, or standing like a tree, serves as a powerful metaphor and physical reality for this transformation. Rooted deeply in the earth, the body becomes stable. The breath becomes deep and rhythmic, oxygenating the brain. The mind settles into a state of alert stillness, watching the present moment with eagle-like intensity. In this state, nothing is forgotten because everything is fully experienced. The noise of anxiety and the fog of lethargy are burned away by the fire of discipline. This path requires the courage to confront the uncomfortable truth that much of what is called aging is actually neglect. It asks the individual to stop drifting and start steering. The exercises are simple but not easy. To do one thing at a time, to inhabit the body fully, to breathe with purpose, and to remain endlessly curious. The brain, perceiving this renewed demand for excellence, responds by reactivating dormant pathways and strengthening connections. The senior moments become less frequent not because the years have rolled back, but because the person has finally woken up. Ultimately, the goal is not just to remember a grocery list or a name, but to remember oneself. The clarity of memory is the byproduct of a life lived with high resolution. By clearing the hindrances of sloth, doubt, and agitation, the natural luminosity of the mind is revealed. The hidden warning signs are actually invitations, alarms going off to wake the sleeper before the night truly sets in. The power to reclaim the mind lies in the decision to be relentlessly present, to treat every moment as if it is the only one that matters, because, in truth, it is. The legacy of this practice is a mind that does not fade into the gray, but burns brightly until the very end, a testament to the unconquerable nature of the cultivated human spirit. Am I ready to undertake the discipline required to wake up?